Hey, I'm Jeffrey Lunn, and I want to welcome you to the cell phone photography, the module one of the series. Our goal is to improve the quality of your cell phone pictures, and with the right techniques, you'll be able to get great images with your cell phones. Cell phone camera pictures are kind of a new dialect of photography. Unlike regular camera pictures, they're not originally intended for prints or enlargements. Their primary uses are for fun, casual documentation and sharing. And for that reason, I think it's important that we don't overthink the process with our cell phones because the cell phones really do the heavy lifting and we just point and shoot. But there are some things that we can do to improve our batting average and get better pictures consistently. Your cell phone is a storytelling device and it's a way to record elements of your life. The hardware is basically a light, tight box with a lens. It's no different than my first camera. Is there that Brownie Hawkeye, or the professional camera that I use. You can see me in the reflection of the cell phone. It's just all a light, tight box with a lens. And just like any camera, the basic shooting rules apply. Let's look at the most common reasons for bad photos and then point out how to avoid them. If you use the best shooting methods, you'll minimize these problems. The pixelated problem, the blurry problem, and the grainy problem. Pixelation is when you enlarge the photo too much. We'll talk about that. Blurry is pretty self-explanatory. Grainy is when you're in a very low light situation and your camera is struggling to get enough light. So let's talk about the pixelation problems first. This can come from zooming in on a subject to make things look closer. So we have this shot and we're zooming in, and so this method, it doesn't use a lens zooming. It just makes the image bigger and the extra just spills out of the frame. So the more you zoom, the more you throw away. So what you're left with are bigger pixels, and that is much less sharp. So it's okay to zoom in a little bit, but I prefer walking in to get a bigger image size. But if you do zoom in, just realize that picture is not going to be presentable when it gets big on the screen. It'll be okay, use it for an email, just to share some casual shots, but it's never going to be very high quality when you zoom in and then take the picture. Now, newer cameras have more than one lens, so you can zoom in by choosing to use the telephoto lens. Look on the back of your camera to see if you have more than one lens. If you do, you should use those lenses, not a finger zoom. This cell phone has two lenses, and that yellow spot is not a lens. That's actually a flash, a light, an LED light. So the updated two-lens feature on the iPhone 7 Plus and newer, I think we're up to iPhone 11 now, and the Samsung 8, and I think we're also at Samsung 12 now or something. Most of those have two lenses on the back, and then they have an LED light that can be used as a flashlight, and it also acts as a camera flash. The normal lens, which is one of those lenses, is similar to about a 26 millimeter lens on a 35 millimeter camera, and the telephoto lens is similar to a 56 millimeter lens on a 35 millimeter camera. So that telephoto lens, that's just slightly longer than normal. A 35 millimeter camera, normal was 50 millimeter lens. So at 56 millimeters, it's really not a telephoto. Anyway, let's look at your camera and see how many lenses you have. Nokia released a cell phone with 5 lenses in 2018, but I haven't seen it here yet. Very soon, though, there won't be a reason to buy a full-size grown-up camera because these cell phones the cameras are getting so terrific and they're adding lenses to them that eventually there's just not going to be any need to lug around a big camera. We're getting close to that now. So if you have more than one lens, you'll be able to select between them by touching an icon just above the white shutter button. This is the same on Apple and Android phones. So if you have more than one lens, take a photo right now with each lens. How do you switch the lenses? Well, you'll see that there's on the Apple there's a 1x. That's the telephoto or the normal lens, and I'm sorry, that is the normal lens, and then the 2x you can switch that just by touching the screen. That will double the magnification. That's the telephoto lens. With the Samsung phones, this one has 3 lenses on the right, and so they just have a picture of a tree, a single tree, and then 2 trees is the normal, and then the wide angle is the 3 trees. Let's take a look at what these do. This is the view with the 1x, the normal lens on an iPhone. And this is with the 2x. Let me toggle between those. You can see that it makes the, it moves you in. It's like you walked across the street. It kind of doubles the size of that shadow of the water tower. When Apple started adding additional lenses on the Model 7, they made a scale appear on the screen. So as you zoomed in with your fingers, the scale would indicate the magnification, and then it would automatically switch from one lens to another. It would assume that if you zoomed in with your fingers, you wanted to use the telephoto, and it would automatically switch to the telephoto lens. But that feature was removed. For some reason, it just didn't work out well. So if you have a 7 or a 7A, it's going to have that feature, and it will automatically switch between the normal and the telephoto. But if you don't, it's going to have this 1 and 2K indicator, and you press it and it just switches from 1 to 2. You press it again, it switches from 2 to 1. Okay, so the Samsung Note 10 has a wide angle, a normal, and a telephoto lens. In my opinion, Samsung is the best cell phone camera out there, but I'm biased. I've had them both. I just like Samsung. I just think they're always about a year ahead of Apple. So this is the wide angle lens on a Samsung. It's very wide. If you're doing interior shots, you're an architect, interior decorator, contractor, or whatever, this 3-lens Samsung cell phone camera is just going to be perfect for you to document your work. This is the medium angle. So again, this is the wide angle. Then we go to the medium angle, and this is the telephoto. And all 3 are very, very sharp. Let's go to another problem that we'll run into. It's called lens flare. It's a very common problem. It happens anytime direct sunlight hits your lens, and the light bounces around inside the lens, and it creates these hexagons. They're usually pink and green, and also a bunch of other kind of smeary results. So we want to avoid lens flare. That happens when the lens is, let me back up. It happens when the lens is dirty or you're pointing it at the sun. Another problem we have are blurry images. They almost always occur from the camera or the subject moving. So as long as you hold the camera very steady, you'll be able to dispense with this blurriness because the modern cameras are really quite good at getting good, sharp, steady images. But one thing that will help you is don't bang your finger on the shutter button. Just gently press it, and that will keep the camera from jerking at the time of the exposure because that causes a lot of blurriness. Now, cell phones are great at stopping action in bright daylight, but not so good at freezing motion in low light. So this is what you can expect if there's a moving subject in low light. That's one of the drawbacks of a cell phone camera is you really don't have the ability to stop action in low light. But it can also be used to get some nice motion effects. So just be aware that you're not going to be able to freeze motion like for sports at like an indoor volleyball game. That's not a good, it's not a good place to be depending on your cell phone. Another cause of blurry shots is a dirty lens, like from oil or from your fingers or food smeared on your cell phone. So can you clean your cell phone lens with a soft shirt or a tissue? Yes. I don't recommend doing it with a big grown-up camera unless you have a skylight filter on it. But as long as there's no grit on the cloth or tissue that you're using, the lens on a cell phone is protected by a clear Pyrex glass filter that is scratch resistant. So you can clean your lens often with your t-shirt and you will be fine. It will not scratch your lens. Another thing that we get bad pictures from is bad setup. Bad indoor photographs are often caused by poor shot setup and bright windows in the background. Everything that can be wrong with this photograph is wrong. No one's looking at the camera. There's a bright glare because there's the sun hitting a window in the background. It's just an awful photo. This is a pretty good photo. Whenever you take a photo of people seated at a table, always hold the camera higher than your eye level and give your subjects a 1, 2, 3 cue to let them know when the photo is being snapped. And you will get a much better result. And so this goes with any kind of group shot or any shot at all. But groups are particularly, they're just a little more difficult to get a shot. Don't just raise your camera and take a picture and because you'll never be satisfied with it. You need to control the action. People don't know what they look like in a photograph. They need to be instructed on what to do, and they will appreciate your direction when they see the final photograph. So have them stop chewing and sit up straight in their chair, look directly at the camera, not at you, and give them a 1, 2, 3, and you'll be able to get much better images, especially with group shots. Let's look at the distinctions between a cell phone camera and another camera, a big adult camera, to see the limitations. The sensor size of a full-size digital single lens reflex is in the upper left. That is the same as a 35 millimeter camera. So, the size of a color slide, basically. Now, that little blue one in the lower right, that's the size of a lot of the cell phone camera sensors. It's very, very small in comparison. And so things happen. If there's any kind of a bubble in the glass, it would be bad with a big lens, but it'd be really bad with a small lens. So the smaller components they suffer more from bad manufacturing. And that's why a lot of cell phones had bad cameras to begin with. They've really gotten better at that. But it is possible that you'll get a cell phone camera that just isn't quite right because the parts are so small. So when you're in the warranty period or the return phase, boy, I would really check out your camera to make sure that it's working properly and giving you sharp images. And if it's not, return it. Let's compare an image that's taken in bright sunlight. This is a cityscape, and we're going to look at that little place right in the center. The Apple iPhone 6, that's out of date now, but anyway, that little portion of that big photograph here is shown in the upper left, and that's the Apple iPhone 6. And in the lower right, that's a big full-size sensor Nikon D800. So you can see right away, big difference in the amount of color fidelity, the sharpness, the highlight detail is really pretty bad in the Apple, and it's it's expected to be pretty good in the Nikon. Now I've moved the Nikon to the upper left, and I've got the Samsung Note 3 that was out at the same time as the Apple 6, and you can tell the Samsung Note 3 it's already getting pretty close to the Nikon. Samsung really did have good quality sensors quite early on. The difference is even more obvious in situations like nighttime shots. It's a Galaxy 5 Samsung on the left, and the same shot taken, similar shot taken with the iPhone 5S. The 6S was much improved. So back then, Samsung was about 4 times better at low light performance. Now the difference between Samsung and Apple has narrowed considerably. Apple really did a lot to catch up, especially with their low light performance. And so the very latest Apple is pretty much on a par with the very latest Samsung. Doesn't matter which one you buy these days. In modern cell phone cameras, both Apple and Samsung, if you hold the camera steady, your night photos will be very good. One way to steady any camera is to hold it against a wall or put it on the back of a bench or whatever. When you're in a low light situation, just this simple trick will make your low light photos much sharper. And this is what I do with any camera at all, cell phones too, is to steady that camera in low light situations. Let's take the remainder of our time to explore our camera menus. There are more features than we can cover in this session, but let's get started. We'll do what we can today and continue on next meeting. Small sensors make backlit subjects a real problem because of the lens flare and also just the inability to get good contrast. But you can change the exposure on your camera, whether it's a Samsung or an iPhone. What you do is you just hold your finger down on the subject long enough to see a yellow square appear. When this yellow square appears, it's going to have a sun on the right-hand side of it, and moving your finger up and down, moving that sun up and down will make the photograph darker or lighter. And so that will get you out of a bunch of bad lighting problems, very contrasty problems or areas where the highlights are completely burned up. You can just move that sun up and down, and it'll change the exposure of the camera. And that the same goes for Samsung. It's slightly different. You'll get when you hold your finger down and you get that box. The Samsung has a scale on it, and you'll be able to move that. The Samsung also will allow you to, when you go into the Pro mode on any of the Samsung cameras, it'll allow you to change the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO, just like a big grown-up camera. I don't know if the newer Apples do that, but there is an application, we'll talk about that at the end of this course, that you can download, and upload, and load onto your Apple phones, and it will allow you to make all those changes. But I digress. The main thing is that you hold your finger down on what it is that you want to be properly exposed. It will focus the camera on that subject, and then you can change the exposure by moving that sun up and down. And this is another situation where you can lighten or darken the image to your taste. So the newer cell phone cameras also have image stabilization. So this is an 1/8 of a second exposure that's handheld on a cell phone. Boy, I'll tell you, this is a sharp image. I cannot hold a big camera for an 1/8 of a second and expect to have a photograph this sharp. So cell phone cameras with that little bitty sensor, that's a big plus, because they can stabilize the image very, very well. Once you've set the shot up and you use your finger to touch on what it is that you want to be in focus, in this case it was that fountain, I adjusted the brightness ever so slightly and I took that photo. This was with Samsung 8. The newer Apples are even better at night than this older Samsung. Samsung cameras, they have very deep menus, and for more control, there's at least 12 main menus and 48 sub-menus on many Samsung cameras. You access those by touching that gear icon that appears on Samsung. As Samsung cameras get more and more modern, they're including less and less controls. But again, at the end of this course, I'm going to give you a website that you can go to and you can upload an app for your individual camera, and it will unlock a whole bunch of these kinds of menus. So don't fret if you can't find these extra menus on your present cell phone. There's an app that you can download that will give you access to a bunch of them. Let's talk about focusing and depth of field. Let's get more familiar with the focus function. So again, you just hold your finger down on what it is that you want to be in sharp focus, and you'll see that the camera will focus on that, and then you'll be able to decide what goes in and out of focus. So let's get very close to a subject. I've got a Sharpie pen in front of my cell phone. So I press the screen to select that close-up object, and then I take a photograph. That's the one on the left. So that Sharpie pen is probably only 4 or 5 inches away from my cell phone camera, and I pressed on it, got that box, and brought the Sharpie pen into sharp focus. I took the picture. Now, without moving the camera, I pulled my finger away, and then I pressed it onto the background to take a shot. There's guitars hanging up in my office, and you'll be able to see that you've controlled the focus. Now the guitar in the background is in focus, and the Sharpie pen in the foreground is out of focus. So we say that when one thing is greatly out of focus and another is very sharp, we say that the photo has a short depth of field. Depth of field is the area that is in sharpest focus, and if it's very short, like in the photographs that we see here, I decided whether to have the foreground in focus or the background in focus. This is most easily done when your foreground image is very close to the camera. So in bright sunlight, both the foreground and the background may be pretty sharp because your depth of field increases when you go outdoors. The photographer is holding the sunglasses in this shot, just at, right in front of, just in arm's length in front of the cell phone. But both the sunglasses and the person that's pretending to hold them up are in sharp focus. And we say that this photo has long depth of field because both the foreground and the background are in focus. So you're going to have a lot less depth of field when the lighting is lower and when the subject is closer. And when you're outdoors, almost everything front to back is going to be in focus. So let's take a quick moment to set up a shot that employs this extended depth of field offered by your cell phone. This is a big plus. Big grown-up cameras, DSLRs, you can't do this. They don't have long depth of field like this. So if you do this outside, you'll discover that there will be more depth of field outdoors in bright light. You can just, do this with a parked car or pinch a person that is walking across the street or whatever. But the main thing is that we want to be outside in, fairly bright light, and we want to be able to get your hand into that photograph and have your hand and the distant subject in focus. So this extensive depth of field can be a good thing for many outdoor travel shots. This is a cell phone shot in Venice, and everything is in focus. That the handrail in the very near and the person walking across the bridge in the background. That is very good for a lot of travel photos, and that's what makes a cell phone always good to have as your backup camera when you're on vacation. You can take advantage of all that depth of field in situations where you want everything in focus. This was a picture in an airport. I was hired by a contractor that renovates airports. They sent me all over the world photographing airports. And I use my big camera for a lot of the shots, but this one happened to be taken with a cell phone, and they were happy with it. Of course, I never told them that I did it with my cell phone, and otherwise they wouldn't be hiring me to do these shots. But you can depend on getting great depth of field with your cell phone. And if there's any question about what it is that you want to be in focus, you just press it with your finger and it'll come into sharp focus. Usually when I want lots of depth of field like this, I push my finger on something that's kind of close to the camera. Not right in front of the camera, but close to the camera. And that will bring the foreground in focus, and then the background will naturally be in focus. So artistically place background and foreground elements in clever compositions, because outdoors everything is likely to be in pretty sharp focus. Now, this extensive depth of field of older cell phones makes it impossible to blur the background, like this portrait taken with a DSLR. For portraits, it's wonderful to have this really soft background. And up until recently, there was just no way to achieve this with a cell phone. But on the very new cell phones, I want to share with you a setting that they have that will blur the background. The newer cell phones have a portrait setting that blurs the background or the foreground. You choose what it is you want to be in focus. So the background is very nicely blurred here. The camera automatically switches to the telephoto lens in portrait mode on the iPhone. I don't think the Samsung automatically switches lenses. Here we are on an iPhone, and the photographers pushed their finger down on the subject's face, and it has blurred the background. This is what the photograph looks like in the upper left, not in the portrait mode, just in the regular mode. You can see that the chair is in sharp focus. But in the portrait mode, the photographer selects the model and the background is blurred. That's a very nice effect for portraits. It's also a good effect for a lot of subjects where a blurred background is desired. So this was also using that portrait mode. And you could imagine that if that background was really, really sharp, it would be super busy and it just wouldn't have the impact of this short depth of field effect. Now the same feature is called live focus on Samsung. Once you select the object, you can vary the amount of blurring. So if you have this feature on a Samsung, let's try that, and let's try the portrait feature for you iPhone users. For Samsung, you select on the bottom there is a live focus menu item. You select that, and you're going to get a scale that runs along the bottom, and you know, you can vary the amount of focus, and also you push your finger on the area that you want to be in sharpest focus. So you select what it is that you want to be in focus, and then you use the slider to select the amount of blurriness. So let's try that if you're a Samsung user. Let's look at some of the situations where the portrait mode may fail. This is an older iPhone, so of course it's going to have more of a problem than the new one. The iPhone 7, it detected the face and blurs everything else. And the Samsung camera, it actually does it a little differently. It takes two photos and it blurs one and not the other, and it blends them together. I think that the Apple 7, they were better at this portrait blurry mode in the beginning. Let's take a look at some of these because some strange artifacts appear in the early blur technology, and they become apparent on closer inspection. The Samsung is on the right and the Apple is on the left. So in the Apple, the background was pretty well selected, but it also blurred some of the hair. But in the Note 8, that is actually the Samsung phone that I have, the blurry effect is just really splotchy and it's very unsuccessful. So the very newer iterations of both Apple and Samsung are so superior for this now. But there may still be a few little lingering artifacts, like it cut out part of this little girl's hair. It blurred the background quite nicely, but it just took out a chunk of her hair there. So this is an assignment that I'd like you to do. It's an overhead view of your focus selection assignment. Do this after our session. And I want you to make sure that you're very close to the person standing in the foreground, and you're going to focus on them, and then in the next picture you're going to focus on the person in the background. Okay? So let's look at another feature. This is a really terrific feature for cell phones, and it appeared on cell phones first before big grown-up cameras, and I think it is it's just a stellar feature. It's called HDR, and it will appear as a menu selection on iPhones at the top of your screen. If you click it, I believe the HDR icon, it goes from white to yellow, and if it's on yellow, it's activated. What HDR stands for is high dynamic range, and what it does is it takes a normally pretty contrasty situation and it takes three photographs. One of them is underexposed, that's the one on the left, and it gives you pretty good detail in the background, some color on the mountains and so forth. The foreground gets really dark, as you would expect in an underexposed image. The one in the center is the normal exposure. It takes that and gets a lot of good quality, sharp information in the foreground on that pile of wood. And then it takes a third photograph, which is overexposed. Everything is ruined, but it does allow us to see into the shadows of the pile of wood, where the darkest parts of the image are. Now this is the camera does this in about, oh gosh, 1/30th of a second, and it marries them all to produce the image that's at the top, which has really good highlight detail, really good shadow detail, and really good detail all across the mid-range of tones. It does all of this electronically really, really fast. It takes about 1/30th of a second to take the photo, and it takes about 1/30th of a second to process it and render the completed image. So for most of us, we just have HDR on, we take the picture, and boom, it comes up on the screen, and we get a properly exposed, full ratio, photograph. It's really, really great for high contrast situations. I recommend that you have the HDR in auto HDR. You can go into your camera settings and you can find in the HDR setting, you can find HDR off all the time, HDR on all the time, and HDR in the automatic setting. And I think if you just leave it in the auto setting, HDR will come into play when it is needed. It is a terrific feature, and it's getting better all the time. Here's an example of HDR with a backlit subject, and you can see that that photograph of me and you can see my face and details on my sweatshirt, and you can see more details in the background. So HDR has really helped a very, very difficult situation. There's some lens flare in this photo, and I just held my finger up, tried to shade the lens, not very well, I must say, but you can see the improvement from HDR. If side lighted in harsh light, your subject will have burned up highlights on the sun side of their face. And with HDR, the subject, you can see a highlight detail on the really bright side of the face, and you can see into the shadows a little bit more. So HDR is particularly good in these high contrast situations where you're doing portraits. If your subject is front lit, HDR really doesn't help. It just cleared up the highlights, gave us a little more highlight detail here, but it's not an appreciable difference. It's really best when you have both highlight and shadow to deal with. Okay, so we're going to run a test with your cameras with 4 outdoor lighting situations: front lighting, side lighting, back lighting, and open shade. And if you have HDR and you want to see whether it helps, I would do a shot with HDR on, do the same shot with HDR off. And then you can see how well HDR works with your particular camera model. We want to learn how to quickly set up these shots, learn how to hold the camera steady, and see the benefits of each lighting scheme. And lastly, we'll want to test the effect of your HDR feature. That's why we're going to do these shots with HDR and without. Okay, so presumably we are back from going outside and doing our shots, and we'll look at them and evaluate them, and then I'm pausing the program right now to look at your shots, and we'll discuss them. Okay, we're back with the slideshow. Let's test our cameras in an extreme indoor situation. The most extreme situations are usually these stage performances where you have a spotlight on the performer. They are always washed out in these kinds of situations. HDR will help a little bit, but the adjusted exposure that you can achieve will do a much better job. So in this case, there were 2 people standing right next to each other with the same model camera. One of them just took it as you see it on the left. The other person touched that performer with her finger and got that gold box, and it had the sun scale next to it. She lowered the sun scale down, let that background go really dark, and got a proper exposure for the person standing in the foreground. So I want you to look around your house and pick an area that has possibly a lamp in the photo, and take a picture, and you'll see that the lamp is probably pretty burned up. But let's try to get detail on the lamp shade, and by pressing your finger on the lamp will get a little bit darker. We can take the picture, or we can make it darker still by using that slider with the sun on it. This should work inside with a bright window or any other kind of bright light indoors. This is a really terrific way to control your exposure. You just press on it, you get that gold box, and you move the slider. Okay, now there is a flash icon at the top of your screen, and to test your flash with your cameras in high contrast lighting situations, you can just have a person standing in front of a light. I've got my granddaughter standing in front of a light, and basically we just see the light in the background, and she is silhouetted, completely dark. I turn my flash on, and I take this picture on the right. The flash fires, and it lights up her face. I'm very close to her, by the way. I don't know, that maybe less than 3 feet. Your cell phone flash really isn't all that terrific. It's not really bright, but if you get close enough to the subject, the flash will remedy a situation like this. And it's particularly good when you're photographing children in a room. I just would put that flash on all the time, because you can always use extra fill light to fill in the shadows. It's just really a very helpful way to improve photographs indoors. So you want to get used to, you want to get familiar with that flash icon at the top. You press it, and you should have 3 positions. The flash would be on, or you press it again and a line goes through the flash and it's off. You press it again, and most of us will have the flash and an A next to it, which is automatic. But when I'm shooting photographs of children or people indoors, I prefer to have the flash on. So that's just the lightning bolt by itself without a line through it or the A next to it. And it's going to help fill the shadows with your indoor photographs. Okay, that's the end of Module 1. I just want to remind you of the things that I'd like you to do. I'd like you to get familiar with the HDR, take a bunch of pictures inside and out with and without HDR on, so you can see the difference, and do that with backlit subjects. And I also I asked you to do open shade. We're actually going to talk about that in the next setup. I'd like you to choose challenging situations indoors, where someone is sitting under a lamp, or there's a spotlight on them, or in some way in an indoor shot there's a lot of contrast, and I want you to hold your finger on the brightest part of that shot that you want detail in, probably your subject, and adjust it so you get a proper exposure on the subject. Disregard whatever happens to the rest of the photograph, whether it gets too light or dark. Just concentrate on the main subject and adjusting your exposure to taste. And then the last one is to get very close to your subject, a backlit subject, and do a shot with the flash on and off. Okay. Thanks for watching this. I'll see you in the next class meeting.